Hi everyone. Today we are going to fill this palette with my favorite Lukas watercolors. And I've got tons of tubes in here. I think I have 12 tubes to fill this palette with. Now, the reason why I have 12 tubes is because I am starting to hit bottom on some of my favorite half pans from Lukas. I had purchased a few years ago the complete set of half pans, and I have done probably close to 100 paintings at this point now with those pans of paint. And there are some that I just go to all of the time that are my absolute favorite. One of them, for example, is Payne's Gray. I love Payne's Gray. It's one of my favorite colors. So I figured instead of refilling my half pans, I'd rather fill these full pans with the colors that I use all the time. So I don't have to fill them as often. And so I have a little travel set that has all my favorite colors. There must be a reason why I'm using those colors all the time. So I think I want to try, after I fill this palette, I think I want to try to do a painting with just these 12 colors and see how it looks. The supplies I'm gonna need are obviously my palette, and this is the F Club 24 pan palette, and you can get it on Amazon. They usually run between $16 and $18. The quality of these I think is great. I know you can buy the Schminke ones and Lukas brand. You can buy all sorts of different company palettes. And I don't think they're a better quality, but they're so much more expensive. Sometimes they can run $30 for an empty palette. So I recommend, if you want to do your own, just grab one from Amazon. The other supplies we're going to need: washi tape. You can use masking tape or washi tape, it doesn't matter. And I'm gonna put the tape on the pan and label it, so that way I know what color I have if I need to go to refill it or something. A marker, Sharpie. You can use any kind of marker. And my tubes of paint. So what I'm going to do, I'm gonna pull 12 pans out and put the palette aside. And I'm going to do that off camera because it's going to be a little noisy. Okay, so here are my 12 pans. And then what I do is I take my washi tape, I line it up on one side, fold it over, I'll just cut. And you can do this however you want. This is just how I found it works best for me. Fold the sides over. And you don't need to go all the way around. And then on the bottom, I'll fold down one side there, the other side there, and then the center. And that way I have my washi tape. It's pretty secure on there. It's not going to come off. And I can label it. And I find that it's better to do it on the washi tape than writing directly on the plastic. I haven't really found a marker that stays on the plastic without rubbing off completely. But of course, when you want to go wash it off, it doesn't come off perfectly. So I found the washi tape works really great. The marker stays on the washi tape. And then if I decide to change out the palette and I don't want the color in here anymore, I can just peel off the washi tape and I've got a nice empty blank palette ready to go again, or pan ready to go again. So I'll finish putting the tape on the other 11 pans and I'll speed it up so you don't have to watch me doing all of them. Okay, so now all my little pans have their washi tape, and let's start labeling and filling. So let's take a look at the colors I have. I have the Payne's Gray, and I like this because it's a nice cool gray, and you can make some pretty nice greens, very neutral greens with this when you mix it with different yellows. Dioxazine Violet. This is a great dark color. It's a beautiful purple, but it also almost looks black when you're using it at full consistency. So I try to use this instead of black when I'm painting. Ultramarine Blue, and this is the Blue Deep. Makes fantastic purples. So it's in this one. We have Raw Sienna. Raw Sienna and Dioxazine makes a fantastic sand. As I'm going through these colors, I realize why I like them so much. I can think about times I've used them in paintings. Cobalt Violet. Indanthrone Blue. This one, like the Dioxazine, looks almost black straight out of the tube and at full concentration. So I use this one a lot, again, instead of a black. We have Raw Umber. Purple. Lemon Yellow, which is considered their primary yellow for the Lukas brand. I like this one, and I think I use this one a lot because it's a very neutral yellow. It doesn't lean warm, it doesn't lean cool, so it makes great greens and it makes great oranges. Cobalt Blue. Indigo. Oh my goodness. You can tell I really like my cool colors. And Van Dyke Brown. This is a very cool set of colors. Literally, they're all cool colors. Except for maybe the Raw Sienna. Maybe that's considered a warm color. And this purple is kind of a warm purple. I'm trying to think what I could possibly paint with just these colors and no reds. We'll come up with something. Okay, so let's do the yellow first, and I'm going to show you what I put on the pan. I'm going to put the color name right across the front on the large side, and then I'll put the Lukas number on one side, and I'll put the pigment color on the other side. So in this case, I'm going to label this Lemon Yellow Primary. I'm going to put 1021 here because that's the Lukas number, and it makes it easier when I have to find them to order them. And then over here, I'm going to put the pigment number. So 1021. Lemon Yellow Primary. And then this one I think is PY3. Yep, right there. Pigment Yellow 3. PY3. Okay. pop it in here before I fill it. And I'm gonna do it so the label's facing out. Not that it really matters because you can't see it, but it'll make me feel better. Open the tube. Ooh. Now these tubes are 24 milliliters. They're huge. They're almost double the Danielle Smith and the M. Graham, but they're about the same price. Some cases a little bit cheaper, so you're getting quite a bit of paint, and it's good quality paint. Ooh, that was messy. That was a juicy yellow. Okay. And on to the next one. So I'm actually going to switch to a Copic multiliner in the 0.3. The Sharpie didn't come out as dark as I wanted it to, so I think this one might work a little better. Let's do the Raw Sienna next. Raw Sienna. It's 1039. And it's PBR 7. Yeah, that shows up much better. Snap it in next to the yellow. Move these off to the side. And now I know to expect that this is going to come out fast. That's a really large opening. That's probably why it gushes so much. I would think it would actually be kind of hard to fill half pans with these big tubes. And then if you squeeze the sides of the tube, not the front and the back, but the sides themselves, it'll suck the paint in and it won't drip out as much. A little trick for you. All right, that one didn't gush out as bad. Now what do I want next to the yellows? Do I want, I think I'm gonna do the Van Dyke Brown, because it's a little warmer. And then I'll do the raw umber, and then we'll go into the blues and the purples. Now I am going to grab a piece of watercolor paper, cut it to fit right in here, and I'm going to do a little swatch chart so I can see the colors on watercolor paper. Okay, so I'm going to store them in a plastic bag in my watercolor bin. And the reason why I'm tossing them in a plastic bag is to hopefully keep them from drying out. Usually tubes don't dry out, but if there's a slight crack or something that I'm not seeing, it is possible that they can dry out. And you can still use them by peeling open the tube and just working out of the tube, but I'd rather not have to do that. So in all of my watercolor painting, I've only had one tube dry out on me. It was an M gram, and they ended up sending me a new tube because it wouldn't re-wet. I guess they had some problems with it, like a bad batch or something, but other than that, I've never had them dry out. But this is just a precaution.
I have my 2 jars of water off to the side. I want to make sure my brush is super clean while I'm doing my swatching. I probably should have waited for this paint to dry. It makes it a little bit more difficult to get a small amount of paint to do the swatches when they're still wet. One thing I've noticed with Lukas watercolor paints, they rate themselves pretty harshly on their transparency scales. Once I got into the Van Dyke Brown and the raw sienna, those are marked as semi-transparent, and the raw umber is actually marked as opaque, but in reality, it's not opaque at all. You can see the pen marks right through my swatch. So I'm not entirely sure why Lukas rates themselves so harshly on their transparency scales, because all of these watercolors are very transparent. You can see as I start getting into the raw umber, the Payne's Gray, the indigo, and the indanthrone, I am able to achieve some very dark values with these watercolors. They're super pigmented, and I like that I can get really dark values without having to resort to a black. I like the idea of using this Lukas palette as my travel palette and as the palette I take around with me when I go to art class, things like that. They dry really well and they re-wet really easily. While I love my M gram watercolors and I think they're absolutely stunning, a huge frustration I have with them is they don't dry completely. And where I live in New England, we can get some super humid days. And if I don't keep my palette perfectly flat, those colors are souping around and gushing everywhere. So I love the Lukas paints because they do dry completely and they re-wet super easily. So it's the best of both worlds. Dioxazine Violet is one of my favorite colors. I think I probably use it in about 75% of my paintings. The next one is the Cobalt Violet, and I like it because it's a soft purple without needing to mix in a white. Sometimes you can't achieve a soft purple by just adding water to a dark color like the dioxazine. And the final purple that I have almost leans towards a pink, so you can treat it like a magenta almost on a color wheel. And here are the colors all swatched out. As you can see, they're super vibrant, very pretty. And it fits perfectly into the lid of my palette. So I thought I recorded myself making some secondary colors, but apparently I deleted the footage. The green that you see here is the primary yellow mixed with Payne's Gray. Again, like I said earlier in the video, that's one of my favorite ways to make a nice toned down green. And then you can see the purple mixed with the primary yellow on top and then mixed with the raw sienna underneath, give you some toned down oranges. So this palette is a little bit more versatile than it might appear, considering it doesn't have a true red. I went on Pixabay and I found this royalty-free image of a bird, and I thought the colors in the photo went pretty well with the palette that I have. So let's get this into the sketchbook and start painting. I figured I could use this as an opportunity to try my new Paul Rubens sketchbook that I got for Christmas. I have no idea what it's like to paint in it, so let's give it a whirl. I've had a few people ask for me to do a real-time painting demonstration, so I'm trying to get the palette and my sketchbook to fit in frame and have it close enough that you can still see the bird. So I picked out my Escoda Versatile and two of my Mimic squirrel brushes, and I use a rag to dry my brush instead of paper towel because I find using paper towel is too wasteful. I just toss the towel into the washing machine when it gets too dirty. I like the look of clean edges on some of my paintings in my sketchbooks. So I figured because I've never used this paper before, I wanted to see how well masking tape would stick and also how cleanly it will remove from the paper. Sometimes paper is super fragile and the masking tape will rip it. That's actually why I hate bee paper. I had bought a few packages of it a few years ago, and masking fluid and masking tape just does not mix well with bee paper. I know some people love it, but not this girl. The first thing I'm going to paint is the background, and I am using a little bit of Payne's Gray and a little bit of Indigo Blue, and I'm just mixing it on the palette with some water. As I use this palette a little bit more, the water and the watercolor won't be beating up as you can see it's doing right now. I'm testing the paint on a little scrap of paper. I usually keep a little piece off to the side if I'm not sure what the color is going to look like, especially because it is beading in the palette. Before I commit to putting anything on my actual piece of artwork, I like to test it out on a scrap piece of paper. As I'm applying the color, there's a few things I'm trying to keep in mind. One is to make sure I'm using plenty of water and not to let any of the edges of the water dry. So what you're going to see me do is I move from the top of the wash to the bottom of the wash, to the top of the wash, back to the bottom of the wash. And I just make sure I keep that paint flowing because if you let the edges dry, you're going to have a hard line when the full background dries. And it's going to be kind of hard to blend that out. It's not impossible, but I try to avoid that if I can by just making sure that I keep all of my edges wet and flowing. I probably could have used a bigger brush from the background. I was just too lazy to go through my brushes and grab another one. The first thing I noticed working on this Paul Rubens paper is it seems very heavily sized. A little bit more so than maybe Arches. I might take a few more paintings before I'm 100% sure about that, but the water definitely seemed to sit on top of the paper. It didn't sink in right away. And that's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's just something that you have to work with and get used to. It's hard to judge a paper the first time you use it to see whether or not you like it. Every paper is slightly different, and you have to adjust your techniques to the individual paper. One of the things I like about a heavily sized paper is the color will lift easily if you make a mistake. And again, this could be a bad thing if you're using gouache on a heavily sized paper, because as you layer, the gouache will come off very easily. So it's good to have a variety of paper in your collection, and it's good to play with different kinds of paper. I think it improves your techniques and your skills if you are able to adapt and you don't get stuck in a rut and use the same products over and over and over again. I'm trying to not be too fidgety painting around the bird and around the branches. I tend to paint very tight and very detailed, and I'm trying to break away from doing that and try to paint a little bit looser. I definitely would not say that this painting ends up being a loose painting, not even close, but I'm trying not to be hyper-focused on detail and remind myself that this is just a sketchbook, this is just practice, I'm just using it for the first time. It's easy for me to get hyper-fixated on details and accuracy. So as I finish the background, I know that before I proceed and paint the bird or the branches, I have to let this completely dry. So I let that happen off camera. It took about 5 minutes. I have a wood stove that I use to heat my house, so the air is very dry, so it does not take long at all for the background to dry. And a good way to test to make sure the paper is dry enough, if you put your hand on the paper and it feels cool to the touch at all, it is not dry enough, so stop, walk away, and come back and try again later. So the reason why I'm doing a voiceover over the real-time video of this painting is because I've got dogs. They are always walking in and out of the room. It can get a little noisy. So I'm going to do my best to describe my thought process as I watch myself paint. I used the primary yellow on the bird. I realized I had gone into the white part of his belly a little bit, so I used the brush to lift some of that color up. And then I'm just spreading it around. I didn't want it to flow too much. That's why I didn't want to put water down first. I wanted the color to be intense, so that's why I pulled directly from the palette onto the paper without doing a wash of water on the bird first. I'm constantly glancing at my reference photo because part of watercolor is planning ahead. I like to work from my lights to my darks, and I noticed that his head, my pencil lines were a little dark for his head once I was going to put in the blue. So I grabbed my mono eraser and I just tried to lighten up my pencil marks a little bit. And I also realized I did not mean to put that dark color on his face where I put it. So I just lifted it right up. A lot of people think that you can't correct mistakes in watercolor, and you absolutely can. Don't be afraid of diving in there with your paint because most of it is very easily liftable. I find if I take my brush and I dry it off on my rag, the bristles are much more absorbent and will suck the color and suck the paint right off the paper. I'm using the same color on the bird's face that I used on the background to tone down the white feathers. I know it looks gray right now, but once I add the colors around his face, once I add the blue and once I add the dark markings around his face, that gray is actually going to appear white. One thing that a lot of beginner painters do when they see something white in a reference photo or in life, they just leave it stark white, and it actually almost never is stark white. So instead of finishing the bird right away, I'm jumping to work on some of the flowers. And the reason why I'm doing that is the bird needs to completely dry before I add any more details. If I were to add details to the bird right now while he's wet, the color would spread, and I don't want that to happen. Watercolor does take patience, which I don't have. You're going to see later on in the video, I actually painted a few parts too early, and the color did spread into areas I didn't want it to, so it was a little frustrating. But yeah, watercolor is definitely a good strategy to work on your patience. So one thing I do is just hop around my painting and paint different areas as previous areas are drying. So to tackle the forsythia flowers and buds, I tried one of these front flowers first. I wanted to experiment a little bit before I committed and did the same technique on all the flowers. I put a light wash of yellow and raw sienna on the flower. And then I took some Payne's Gray and the yellow to make a green. I knew I was going to want to have some green bleed into the flower towards the base. And it didn't end up being as concentrated and as pigmented as I wanted. So I kept playing with it and adding a little bit more color at a time. And part of this was trying to see how the paint flowed on this paper. Because I kept adding so much water, I did realize that I was going to have to let it dry before I was able to bump up the color saturation. It wasn't accepting any more pigment. So I said, all right, I'm going to let that dry and let me go into some of the other buds. So this time when I went in, I used less water because I knew I was going to want to have more color saturation than on that first flower. So I just did a lot of yellow pigment and I threw it in all of the buds. Well, not all of the buds, but a good number of the buds. And I wanted that pigment to be nice and concentrated. There really is no secret on how to watercolor. You just have to dive in and play with it. I'm constantly modifying my strategies as I paint. It changes honestly on a day-to-day basis. It depends on the humidity in the air. It depends on the supplies you're using. It's hard to explain to somebody how to watercolor. It's definitely a medium that you just have to feel how it's flowing. While the yellow was still wet on these buds, I took a little raw sienna and I just dabbed it into the tip. And then I took some of the green that I had made and dabbed it into the base. And I let the colors kind of meld on their own together. I didn't force it to do anything. I just let it happen naturally. I liked what was happening with the buds, so I decided to tackle the larger clump of flowers that was behind the bird. I didn't want to do it super in focus because it is behind the bird and I wanted the detail to be on the main subject of the painting, the bird itself. So I just went in with some of the yellow again, and then I dabbed in the raw sienna and the green, and I wasn't worried about the concentration of the color here. I just kind of wanted to create some flowing colors, and I knew that I could go back once it was dry and punch up color if I wanted to. So if you're still here watching this and you stuck around this deep into the video, boy, oh boy, do I appreciate you. As I'm doing this, I can understand why a lot of YouTubers do sped up videos. I feel like this must be so boring for you to watch. So if it's not, and if you like these real-time videos, make sure you give this a like and maybe comment down below, because I want to make sure as this channel grows, I'm giving people what they want to see, and I don't want to bore anybody. As I'm dabbling more colors into this flower, let's see who else has stuck around. Why don't you let me know if you like these smaller sketchbook type paintings, or if you would want to see a larger format piece. That's usually how I work. I don't normally work in sketchbooks. I do want to try to change that. I feel like I am more apt to experiment in a sketchbook. To me, there is less risk if I mess up. It's just one page and I can do a better job on the next page. When I use my larger paper, I find that I tend to take less risks because I don't want to mess up using such a huge piece of paper. As a result, some of my favorite pieces that I've done have been in a sketchbook. Then I face the dilemma, do I tear it out of the sketchbook so I can hang it up, or do I let it just lie peacefully in the little book where no one really can see it? What are your thoughts on it? If you create something really pretty in a sketchbook, do you leave it or do you take it out? Let's chat about the painting again. I tackled the branches by doing a pretty concentrated wash of raw sienna onto the branches. And then while it was still wet, I took a little bit of Van Dyke brown, because it's a nice dark brown, and I just dragged my brush along the edge of the branch, the bottom edge of the branch. This left a sharp edge for the bottom of the branch, but because I was also touching the raw sienna, the top part of that dark line bled into the raw sienna, creating kind of a natural shadow and branch look. And then I repeated that process for each section of branch. When I did it here, I noticed that the Van Dyke brown wasn't quite spreading as much as I wanted it to. So I just took some more of the raw sienna, a little bit more of a watery consistency this time. And I just dabbed it onto the branch, and it created that bleeding effect again. And then I went back to the first part of the branch because I did want it a little bit darker on the bottom. So I added some more concentrated Van Dyke brown pigment. One thing I found that I'm struggling with as I'm making these YouTube videos is I have my camera above the painting so you can see what I'm doing. But because my eyesight isn't fantastic, I do wear corrective lenses, but I still always find that I need to have my face an inch off of the paper. Painting from so far back so that you're not seeing the top of my head and you're seeing the painting is actually pretty challenging. I find that I am making, I don't want to say mistakes, but maybe I'm not being precise as I want to be. Maybe that's not a bad thing, because like I did say earlier in the video, I'm trying not to be so hyper-focused on details. And I'm trying to just play and have a little bit more fun. I ended up being pretty happy with how this back part of the branch came out. If you let your medium work for you and you don't try to control too much of what you're doing, you just let the watercolor flow, I think you can get some really fantastic results naturally. At this point in the painting process, I'm just kind of scanning the painting, noticing what buds I have left blank that I need to fill in. Some of them in the reference photo were yellow, so I continued to do the process where I put in the yellow paint and then did a tip of the raw sienna and a base of green. Oof, as I'm watching this footage back, I realize I am not gentle with my brushes at all. I am scrubbing that rigger brush into that paint. A rigger brush is great for doing thin lines that might be pretty long. Rigger brushes have nice long bristles, but not many of them. So they're nice thin brushes that still hold a lot of paint, and you can get nice thin lines pretty easily by using them. And then some of the other buds in the photo are completely unopened, so they're brown. So I just used a mixture of the Van Dyke brown and raw sienna, and I just used the tip of the paintbrush because it's kind of bud shaped, and I just tapped it onto the paper. So I continue to look at my reference photo so I know where to dab in some of the buds because I didn't draw all of them in. I'm not sure if you've noticed yet at this point, but whatever brushes that I'm using for the painting, but that I'm not currently painting with, I usually keep in my left hand, and then the brush that I'm using, because I'm right-handed, I keep in my right hand, and that way I'm not constantly putting them down on the table, and I'm not letting the brushes sit in water. That's the worst thing you can do with your watercolor brushes. Do not let the ones you're not using sit in the water. What will happen is the water will soak up the bristles, it'll get into the glue, it'll make your wood of your brush expand, your paint will crack, your bristles will fall out, you'll have a mess. So either put your brushes flat on the table or hold them in your non-dominant hand. I'm noticing I need a little bit more of the darks on my branches over here, so I am barely letting my brush touch those branches. I don't want there to be too much pigment, but I do want a little bit more of a defined edge. So the next 3 minutes of footage is just me dabbing in more buds and painting in more branches. I don't think that I can come up with anything to talk about for the next 3 minutes. So feel free to skip ahead because that's when I start working on the bird again. I did toss around the idea of either speeding up this footage or cutting it out, but I did really want you to get an idea of a real time painting and how long it actually takes me to get done this really small bird. I did notice as I was listening back to this footage, you can hear the television on in the background. So maybe I should talk for a little bit so I don't get copyright dinged or anything. What do you normally do when you're painting? Do you focus all of your energy on painting and all of your attention on the painting? I personally love to listen to audiobooks and podcasts. I didn't for this video because I knew I was going to be doing a real-time painting for you, and I knew it was going to be pretty quick painting. My attention span is pretty short, so in order for me to sit and have a good solid painting session, I definitely need to have something on distracting me from what I'm doing. And I know that sounds silly that I want to be distracted from my painting, but if I'm not listening to something, I get super bored super fast. So you might see me tapping my painting with my finger, and that's just to test to make sure the paper is completely dry before I add any more color into that area, especially if I don't want it to bleed, if I just want sharp details. And again, the paper might actually feel dry, but if it feels cool at all, it is not dry. And pretty soon, when I'm painting that bird's beak, you're going to see what happens when the paper isn't dry. So let's get back to the bird. I am now tackling his tail, and I'm using the same colors that I used for the background, the indigo blue and the Payne's gray, but I'm using it in a higher concentration, and that's for 2 reasons. One, because the tail is in shadow, so it's going to be darker. There's no light hitting the tail, but also because I want it to stand out from the background. You don't want it to be the same exact color as the background because you're not going to be able to see it. I think a huge part of creating a nice piece of art is having a good reference photo. Just because something makes a pretty photo doesn't mean that it's going to make a pretty painting. You want to make sure you have a lot of contrast in your reference photo, because sometimes a reference photo that looks pretty but is all the same value is not going to make a great painting. It's going to be kind of boring. Details aren't going to stand out as well. So you want to make sure that there's enough variety in the reference photo for you to make a nice painting. For the top of the bird's head, I took a little bit of the cobalt blue and I mixed it in with the same paint that I used for the background to tone it down a little bit. and I just painted it directly into his head. And then the bottom of the blue part of the feathers is a little bit darker in the reference photo, so I took some of the indigo and I wanted a little bit more concentration of color, and I just dabbed it into the bottom, and I let the paint feather how it wanted to. I wasn't too cautious. I figured the feathering of the paint would mimic the feathers on his head, and it did. So right here in my reference photo, I noticed that it looked like there was, I don't know, kind of like dried moss or something on the branches. So to give it a similar look on the paper, on the painting, I made sure my brush was almost completely dry. I picked up a high concentration of my dark browns that I've been using, and I did some dry brushing. I just let the brush drag over the paper, and very, very lightly, and I let the paper just kind of pick the pigment that it wanted to, and it gave kind of a mossy, dried mossy look to the branch that I was happy with. And while I wait for the bird to dry a little bit, I'm going back to the buds and the branches. So yeah, watercolor is just constantly going back and forth into different parts of the painting. It's a very, very different tactic from colored pencil or from acrylic, where you can focus on one section of the piece at a time, get it done, and then move on. The watercolor, I'm just constantly bouncing around. I like seeing the progression of the piece at this point. I like seeing the blank spots fill in. And while I'm filling that in, I'm trying to punch up color in certain areas. Some of the flower buds weren't quite as vibrant as I wanted them to be. So I went back with more concentrated color and I filled them in. And at this point, because they were dry, the color was able to stay more concentrated and didn't spread out as much. I'm also starting to realize I am thoroughly enjoying this paper. I got no cauliflower effects at all as I was layering the paint. There was not a lot of backgrounds of color. This is definitely high quality paper. So I'm thinking I'm probably gonna see how it compares in price to Arches, and to see what the biggest sizes are that it comes in. I don't think I've seen it as loose paper. I think I've only seen it in sketchbooks. And that would be through YouTube videos. I mean, that's how I've become familiar with this paper. Once I'm done dabbing the paint into this cluster of flowers, I'm going to go back to the bird. He's a little bit drier now, or totally dry. Because his belly has this spray of black feathers, I chose to do a light wash of water on his belly and then dab in the Payne's Gray and just let it flow how it wants to flow. You're going to see me dab his belly with my rag. There was a tiny bit too much water on there and I wanted to get it off before I put on the color. I made sure I was accurate with my center line of color, but I also wasn't overly concerned if it wasn't exactly what the reference photo looked like. Nobody's going to be examining my painting to the reference photo side by side, so I don't care if there's a little bit of a variation. I did dab in water in certain spots where I knew I wanted to make sure the Payne's Gray feathered out a bit. And again, I'm using the background color to tone down his belly and put it a little bit into shadow so it shows that he has a round belly and it's not perfectly flat. Because the yellow of his body was dry, I dipped the brush into a more concentrated combination of the indigo and the Payne's Gray, and I painted his back. because you can see just a tiny bit of his back feathers along the right-hand edge of his body. I probably should have grabbed a brush that had more of a pointy tip because I barely touched the brush to his back in order to keep that thin line. And then because there's slight feathering on the inside of that black line, I went back in with a little bit of yellow and I let those feathers blend in slightly to his back. All right, so now you're going to see me going back to the branches, and you should know why by now, because I have to let the bird dry before I put on any more detail. Before I really started painting regularly, when I would watch YouTube videos, I used to be amazed at how quickly things got done and how quickly the artists got their paintings done. But now that I'm actually painting and I've done it for a few years, I realize it takes a lot more time than you realize. I mean, this painting is probably, I don't know, maybe 4x6. And it is not a super detailed painting. And yet, I think we're about, I don't know, I think it took probably about 45 minutes to get it done. All right, so now let's do his little legs. I did grab a tiny little brush for this because I knew I was not going to be able to get the detail that I wanted if I was using the brushes I've been using for the whole painting. And again, I used the same colors that I used for the background, just as a higher concentration. I do find that when I'm painting, I usually stick to only 5 or 6 colors naturally. Very rarely do I use more than that. I find that using a limited palette gives your painting a more cohesive look. And I try to make sure I have paints that can achieve light values and paints that can achieve dark values. Okay, so right here you see me going in with a very light wash onto his beak. And I kind of just dab in some concentrated color, and then I realized, oh goodness, that's too much. So then we went to go lift it, and that's when I started losing detail on his beak. It was kind of annoying. It was feathering out a little bit, and it just wasn't as sharp, and to me it like really warped the shape of his beak. I definitely should have let it dry before I put on that dark concentration of color. But I wasn't patient, and as a result, I was not happy with his face. If it had happened to one of the buds, I wouldn't have been so upset about it, but because it's his beak and it's literally the main focus of the painting, his face and his body, I was annoyed. But it's just a sketchbook. It's not the end of the world, so I kept painting. At this point, I keep referring quite a bit to my reference photo. I just want to make sure I have my values as accurately as possible. I want to make sure I've got all the darks in that I want. Don't be afraid of putting in your darks. It gives interest to your paintings. And I ended up putting in a little bit too much dark right there, so I went back with my rag and I sucked it up. So again, don't be afraid of the darks. You can correct them. And over here, I'm just going in and making sure it looks like my buds are attached to the branches of the tree. Some of them look like they were kind of floating off in space, so I wanted to correct that. And I'm going in and adding a little bit more to his tiny, twiggy little legs. I love bird legs. They're so cute. They're so tiny. And of course, I'm going in and touching that little branch area before I add color to the branch. I want to make sure his foot is dry. I would hate to see his foot bleed into the branch. So you see me testing his beak to make sure it is in fact dry this time. And then I put a little bit of water over his face because I am going to try to get in the black detailing on his face. I do want to make sure that it's not too wet. I don't want it to bleed everywhere, but I want to make sure that it's damp enough that I can achieve a feathering effect once I go in with the Payne's Gray and the indigo. And I almost panicked here. I thought, oh my God, this is bleeding a little bit too much. But I went with it. I trusted my gut and it was fine. And it actually worked out perfectly. It created just enough feathering that it looked like actual bird feathers. When I went in with the water to dampen his face before I put the black coloring in, I avoided his eye. I wanted to make sure that there was no water at all in his eye because when I went in with my really fine brush, I wanted to reserve the highlight of his eye and I wanted to make sure that none of the dark pigment bled into that part of his face. So yeah, you're always having to think ahead in watercolor. You want to make sure that you preserve your light colors if you're not going to want to use an opaque white. If you want to use the white of the paper, definitely make sure you think twice before you put that color down. And I thought his back could use a little bit more detail, so I did this time go in with my tiny little brush to give him his little back feathers. And I wanted to put a little bit more on his belly and on his little feet to make them stand out a bit. And I'm at the point in this painting where I'm just layering a little bit more, increasing some of the values a little bit more. I thought his belly still looked a little bit flat, so I wanted to get in more color and a little bit more shadow. And I want it to look like he actually had feathers on his chest. I did take out about 10 minutes of drying time once I finished up his belly because we are getting to my most favorite part of a painting. All right, this has to be the most satisfying part of a painting, peeling that tape off. I love seeing the nice crisp edges, and I absolutely love how easy it was to remove the tape. Definitely think this paper is great. I can't wait to use it for another painting and see if I like it as much. Once I have the tape off, I am able to give the painting a final once over. I tapped the beak to make sure it was dry because I did want to fix his beak as much as I possibly could. And I think it helps a little bit. And then I went in and add a little bit more detail onto his feet and onto the flower in the background. And that just about did it for the painting. I also extended his tail a little bit because in the reference photo, it did look a little bit longer than what I had here. I did keep going in with darker pigment because, again, the reference photo just showed a little bit more contrast than what I had. And there's the extension. And then ultimately, I guess I only ended up using the primary yellow, the raw sienna, the Van Dyke brown, Payne's Gray, indigo, and that tiny bit of cobalt for his head. I felt like the branches on the right side of the painting were looking a little bare, so that's why I went in with the darks and I added an extra little bud and a few extra little, I don't know, I guess twiggy pieces. And there you have it. If you stayed through this whole video, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Let me know what you think and let me know if you want to see more videos like this. Thanks so much for sticking around. See you later.